Chapter 40. Think with your head, not your heart. The SummerSlam came earlier than usual that August of 1997. I brought Blade with me to New York. He liked to carry my bag and massage my big hands with his tiny fingers. It had been overwhelming to be Stu Hart's kid, but I could see that being Bret Hart's kid could be just as challenging. Blade drew pictures of himself wrestling as Blade's sidekick Hart. When he saw how casual I was with the other wrestlers in the dressing room, he seemed completely at ease with all of them, including Shawn, who wrestled with him in and around the ring while Taker and I worked out our match. Watching Blade with Shawn made me lower my guard a degree. This would be the biggest match Taker and I had ever had, and we wanted to have a classic that would blow away his fans and mine, who had been waiting for this fantasy title match for 7 years. Taker really dug the whole American versus Canadian angle, especially after the Hart Foundation sent Vince's ratings right through the roof a month earlier at the Halifax Raw and then again at the Pittsburgh Raw. That night it seemed like the entire dressing room was lit up, plugged into the Hart Foundation power source. Everyone came back after their matches happy after having worked so hard, and it was building into a great show. Then Owen, in the middle of a super match with Stone Cold, accidentally pile-drived Steve hard, nearly breaking his neck. When Steve moaned to him, "I hurt my neck. Don't touch me. I can't feel my feet," Owen was beside himself with guilt and dread. But he stayed calm despite the jeering of 20,000 fans until it came to him what to do. Like an old pro, Owen played to the crowd, hoping that it would give Steve enough time to recover. Steve somehow managed to crawl over and schoolboy Owen like a weak breeze, knocking over a cardboard cutout for a horrible but doable 1, 2, 3. Steve was helped to his feet by the refs and managed to wobble his way into the dressing room, where he was taken right to the hospital. Owen wandered past me crushed and in a daze. In an in-ring interview, Shawn, who was about to ref my match with Taker, declared that if he didn't call it down the line he'd never wrestle in America again either, another interesting twist. While going over the finish in the dressing room, Shawn had suggested that in order for him to get mad enough to swing a chair, I should spit on him. He'd swing, I'd duck, and he'd crack Undertaker smack on the head. I asked Shawn whether he was sure, and he nodded. I told him I'd aim for his shirt. Mostly boos greeted me when I went out, but I still had a lot of fans who believed that I had never deserted them. Shawn came out to an elaborate fireworks display, dancing like the stripper he must have been in a past life. Then Taker made his entrance in pitch darkness, to funeral music and deafening pyrotechnics. At the sound of the bell we tore into each other, raging on in a beautiful dance of death like our tribal superheroes, making and breaking each other. Shawn refereed right down the middle, with me grudgingly obeying him. Then I twisted Taker's long legs into the sharpshooter. I let him kick out from respect for him, the only time anyone ever kicked out of the sharpshooter. He sent me bouncing right out of the ring and onto the floor. I dusted myself off, marched back in and went for it again. Taker rose up and made his comeback and nearly finished me off, while Shawn was diving to and fro to make every count. I dragged Taker by his stomach to the corner, where I attempted some kind of a half-assed sharpshooter on the ring apron, wrapping Taker's legs around the ring post, barely holding on. When at last he kicked out, he tossed me out right on top of Shawn, who was trying to get me to break the hold. While Shawn collected himself, I grabbed a chair, coolly slid back into the ring and busted Taker over the head. When Shawn finally got there to make the count, Taker kicked out. Shawn noticed the steel chair on the apron, but before he could spin me around and demand to know how the chair got there, I delivered one last kick to Taker's knee. We had words, with me finally shouting, "Fuck you." Our finish needed perfect timing. I had to spit right on cue, but I was exhausted, my throat coated from working so hard. I hacked out an extremely large, milky white slobber knocker. It flew out of my mouth and hit Shawn on the chest, where it flew up to splatter him right between the eyes. He came at me furiously with the chair. I ducked at the last second and heard a smash and a huge pop from the crowd as Taker crashed to the mat. I waved Shawn over to do the count, which he did with spit dangling from his nose. Then he stormed back to the dressing room. I was sure he thought I did it on purpose. Draped in a Canadian flag, with my music playing, I kissed the gold buckle of the belt, then dropped to my knees clutching the belt to my chest. I was aching all over, like one giant throbbing bruise. When I came through the curtain I apologized to Shawn, explaining that I couldn't help the size of the gob, and that it was an accident. He just thanked me for the match, and before either of us realized it we shook hands, for the first time in a long time. I hunched over like someone had beaten me with a stick to untie my boots. I'd pulled my groin badly and I felt like I'd been impaled. Blade, in a long Hitman t-shirt, helped peel my pink wrist tape off and followed me everywhere with the WWF World Heavyweight belt draped over his shoulder and his ball cap on backward. I loved those moments. That night I crawled into my bed with a bag of ice on my knee, a heating pad under my back, and Blade sprawled out sleeping beside me. The next day, he and I caught a lift to Raw in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, with Paul J. in his production van. After all the angles that came out of SummerSlam 97, the Hart Foundation stood in the ring together licking our respective wounds. We should have been triumphant, but instead it seemed like everybody's past was catching up with them. Michelle had just passed on the news that the nerves in Dynamite's back were damaged beyond repair after years of him deadening the warning signs with pain pills so he could go out there and have another great match. He was now paralyzed from the waist down and would be stuck in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Vince had just phased out the costly drug testing he'd instituted at the start of the steroids scandal. Of course, the real danger was not steroids or coke but prescription painkillers. Every night deadly lines were crossed by too many of the boys, and at that time the most vulnerable was Pillman, trying to deaden his ankle pain just like Dynamite had deadened the pain from his back. Sean, Davey, and Hawk were all serious abusers too. We all knew it. The wrestlers openly popped pills in the dressing room, but the agents seemed powerless to do anything about prescription drug use. Chief, once some kind of voice of reason in the dressing room, had been put out to pasture without anyone even seeming to notice, though Vince would never have gone anywhere if it hadn't been for Chief and Pat Patterson. After he retired, Chief became a different kind of wrestling tragedy. He was left to babysit his young grandson one day and fell asleep. When he woke up, he found the child floating dead in his pool. I believed that Chief would never get over it, and my heart went out to him. As I started my 5th run as world champion, Sean was being friendly enough, but I was unhappy with a sexually explicit new storyline centered around him, Hunter, Chyna, and Sean's newly arrived bodyguard, ravishing Rick Rude, who was working as a manager while he was involved in an injury lawsuit. I was happy that Rude was back because he was a good friend, but Sean was now on the booking committee with Briscoe and Hunter. The simple truth was that there was no trust between us anymore. Looking back now, I can see that this wasn't Sean's fault any more than it was mine. Vince was the one who planted and cultivated the seeds of that doubt. Vince was playing with me and Sean like a kid with his wrestling dolls, bashing his old favorite and his new favorite together like he was God himself. On September 7th, I worked at In Your House in Louisville with Del Wilkes, whose gimmick was the Patriot. It was hard to do anything extraordinary because Wilkes had worked only in Japan and wasn't over by any stretch of the imagination in the United States. What had been a red-hot American versus Canadian angle for the WWF lost its heat when the champion had to fight a cartoon, a hokey, masked marvel in red, white, and blue that fans couldn't relate to because, with a mask on, he couldn't express pain or anything. When I asked Pat about the match up, he quipped, "The whole business is a fucking cartoon." I had nothing but respect for Del. We did all we could, but it was a tough haul. Next came 2 days of TV and 4 hard matches, and then I flew up to Toronto for a charity dinner. Dory Funk Jr. had asked me a couple of months earlier if I'd mind working with Terry for his retirement match in Amarillo on a big card billed as 50 Years of Funk. Mind? I had said that I'd be honored. And Dory said that Terry, who like so many of the old school boys had retired only to return again and again, actually meant it this time. So after Toronto I connected through Dallas, where I caught a charter to Amarillo that was packed with the remnants of ECW. I looked at the heads of the young wrestlers, bandages hiding their gig marks, and they reminded me of my old Stampede days. I had a bad flu but couldn't miss such a significant night. I crawled out of bed and drove to the fairgrounds, where I met up with Stu and Bruce, and was saddened to hear from them that Fritz von Erich had died of cancer. In many ways the Funk Show was like traveling back in a time machine. Dory and Terry were old school pros who kindly conducted business the way it had always been done. Japanese reporters swarmed all over as Dory led me down back hallways to a room where he gave me and Terry our finish in great detail. I was happy to put the title up against Terry, but at his insistence, he wanted to put me over, even though it was his retirement match. The Amarillo fans were so fired up about my anti-American heel status that I feared for Stu, who was sitting at ringside. The special referee was Dennis Stamp, that big, lanky wrestler who'd given me one of my first matches back in Amarillo so long ago. When it was over I was so sick I had to crawl back to bed before Terry could even thank me. On September 20th, I arrived in Birmingham, England, for the one-night-only pay-per-view. I got there a day early and found the wrestlers, suits and road crew drinking merrily in the hotel lounge. Hunter had to help a trembling, pilled-up Sean out of his chair and up to his room, in clear view of the fans. On the bus ride to the National Exhibition Center Arena the next day, Taker and I were disappointed to notice that we weren't even pictured on the pay-per-view posters plastered all over town. Sean and Davey were the main event in a European title match. We were baffled as to why the world title match was being ignored, especially when Taker and I had been the biggest draws in Europe for years. But Taker and I knew how much this match meant to our UK fans, so we put our heads together and came up with one that was different from all the others we'd ever had. Actually, this one was for us as much as it was for the fans. I figured I'd finally find out whether the Brits and the boatloads of my German fans who were coming actually supported me in my war with the Yanks. Before the show I talked with a little boy who'd been burned in a fire. His ears were gone. Then I found time to say hello to Davy's family. Davy had made the huge mistake of promising in interviews with the British tabloids that he'd win his title match for his sister, Tracy, who was dying of cancer. He'd been told he was going over, but on the day of the show Vince and Sean changed the outcome. Davy was devastated. Sean had openly bragged about how he was not doing jobs for anyone, but nobody wanted to believe he had such nerve. This went against the code of all wrestlers. Usually Vince or Pat would give me my finishes, but now Sean, Hunter and Briscoe were there to oversee. Something was going very wrong. I always felt that Taker was one of the most unselfish and best workers in the business. We told a great story that night in Birmingham that ended in a DQ, living up to the expectations of our legions of fans. I had no way of knowing it at the time, but Vince in his live commentary was doing all he could to paint me as the bad guy here in Europe, which was contrary to his own plan, or at least to the plan he had described to me. I also had no way of knowing that this would turn out to be the last truly great match I'd ever have in the WWF. Sean worked the main event with Davy, using every gimmick and prop possible to ultimately end up injuring Davy's knee and take the European belt. Vince, Briscoe, Sean and Hunter took great delight in intentionally designing a finish that made me and Owen look like total idiots. For the entire match, we were nowhere in sight as Hunter, Chyna and Rude worked Davy over while the British fans waited for the Hart Foundation to rescue him. After Sean won, he took the house mic and said, "Hart Foundation, this is for you. Diana Smith, sweetheart, this is especially for you, baby." Diana was looking pretty, with stars in her eyes at being mentioned by Sean even though he had just defeated her husband, seated beside Davy's parents and sister. Surrounded by his clique, Sean put the figure 4 on Davy, and Diana leapt from her front row seat and hit the ring. Chyna grabbed Diana from behind as Owen and I finally charged down the ramp with everybody wondering where the hell we'd been all this time. As I pretended to help the wounded Davy back to the dressing room, we passed the burned little boy and Davy's sister Tracy, who was terribly upset and crying. I thought, in wrestling, never make a promise you can't deliver. I saw the light die in Davy's eyes that day, darkness seeping into a heart that was giving out. 2 days later, on September 22nd at Raw in Madison Square Garden, I was summoned to Vince's office for a private chat. He rocked me with the news that he wasn't just thinking of breaching the terms of my contract, but was actually going to do it. In the weeks ahead, he wasn't going to pay me my full salary because of problems he attributed to Ted Turner. He told me that I was the Cal Ripken of the WWF and that he fully intended to pay me what he owed me on the back end of my 20-year deal instead. "You'll still get every penny," he declared. In a fatherly tone, he then confided, "I have no problem if you want to see if WCW will make you that same deal as before. I hear that Hogan is finishing up there soon. Your timing couldn't be more perfect." He went on to say that if I left, I would actually be doing him a favor because he was about to downsize into a northeastern U.S. promotion. Because of my 14 years of loyal service, he said, he wanted to give me the opportunity to be able to approach WCW before everyone else did, since he'd be letting a lot of wrestlers go. He described me as the first guy in the lifeboat. You don't even have to drop the belt if you don't want to. You hold all the cards. He even said that he would secretly help me negotiate my deal, if I wanted. His final words to me were that he'd see whether he could find the money somewhere to pay me, but for now I shouldn't breathe a word to anybody. If the news leaked out that Vince was in trouble, it would hurt my chances with Bischoff. Hurt my chances? I was so stunned by how many promises he broke in one short conversation that I didn't know what to reply. I worked raw like a zombie. New York had always been my best American town, and my loyal following of fans couldn't bring themselves to hate me like I was hated everywhere else. I feared having to sue Vince over my contract and also feared that WCW wouldn't want to pay me so much since I'd turned them down the last time. My worries were only compounded by disgust as Hunter and Sean told me that they wanted me to call them gay in my interview, like a true homophobe. On the mic that night, Hunter referred to the business as a cheap whore with her legs spread wide apart, and he was right, but this was still supposed to be a kids' show. Pat Patterson, back from his break, had Steve Lombardi win a battle royal so Lombardi could face me for the title at the Garden on November 15th. Steve was a veteran jobber, but Pat thought it would be different to let a real dark horse win and have a shot for once. I said, "It's your most important market, and if that's what you want to do, go ahead." Davey wasn't working. He complained that he'd hurt his knee in the title match with Shawn, but I thought what was really hurt was his bulldog pride. I had a dark match that night with Taker and Shawn. He was professional and pleasant, and I tried to relax and take all of this one step at a time. On September 24th, Owen and I drove up to Toledo together listening to the audiobook of The Killer Angels, Michael Shar's wonderful account of the Battle of Gettysburg. We reminisced about the time we were in Kearney, Missouri, touring the outlaw Jesse James's house, where he was shot from behind by one of his own men. Two brothers who are in the same business all their lives live and learn a lot together. I confided to him everything Vince had said. Owen, I'm going to end up getting screwed in the end, with bad feelings for the business and the people in it. Vince told me the business isn't just about the money. What a hypocrite. You'll have to sue him, he said. That night during my match with Taker I did my usual job of taking a severe beating. So severe, in fact, that an overwrought mentally challenged kid hit the ring to protect me. When I came back through the curtain still wearing my belt, he broke away from the police in tears to hug me and tell me that he loved me. For some reason this scene was too hard for Davey to bear, and he told Lanza he was going home, for how long no one knew. October 5, 1997. I took my time getting to the building in St. Louis that Sunday afternoon and arrived well rested for In Your House. When the agents realized that Brian Pillman hadn't arrived with me, they started calling around looking for him. He was soon found dead of a suspected overdose in his room at the Budgetal in Bloomington, Minnesota. Brian was a good friend, a brother among brothers, and we shared a special bond. Just the night before, I remembered Brian leaning back in his chair in the dressing room in St. Paul, his arms crossed, beaming at me with a sparkle in his eye, even though we'd just been talking about how much he distrusted Shawn and the Clique, and how he was worried about his future. I gave him a friendly pat on the chest, and told him, "Don't worry, Bree." And we both broke into big smiles. That's how I'll always remember Brian Pillman. All too quickly after we heard the news, it was business as usual, with everyone hurriedly putting their matches together for the pay-per-view. Vader, who was only trying to make the best of it, said, "Let's not worry about it right now, let's concentrate on the match." I wanted to blast Leon and say, "No, let's worry about Brian instead of the fucking match." That night was a blur as I worked with Davey Boy against the ill-conceived team of Vader and the Patriot. When the fans tuned in to see the live Raw from Kansas City the next day, before the opening sequence even ran, Vince was in the ring announcing Brian's death, as all the boys broke character to stand together at the top of the ramp, breaking kayfabe in solidarity for a fallen comrade for the duration of a stirring 10-bell salute. Rude, Owen, Davey, Jim and I sadly bowed our heads. There were only two wrestlers who didn't come out, Shawn and Hunter. All that day I'd been uncomfortable. Shawn said he wanted me to denounce him and Hunter as homos, but I worried it would only lead to more tension between us. Since both of them were part of the booking committee, I did as I was told. "But I don't want you to say this kind of crap about me," I warned Shawn. The night deteriorated into a lame storyline, with Shawn and Hunter taking shots at me while I stupidly led the Hart Foundation in search of them everywhere in the building, never finding them. Duh. I watched on the monitor backstage as Vince posed probing questions to Melanie Pillman, Brian's pretty, young, clearly distraught wife, live via satellite from her living room. She said to the camera, "It's a wake-up call. Your husband could be next. He lived for this business and died for this business. I hope no one else has to die." Owen and I felt so sorry for her. The whole thing struck us as a ratings ploy, exploiting this poor girl's misery for all the world to see, as if suddenly the WWF had turned into the Jerry Springer show. Things only got worse the next day. The camera came into the dressing room in Topeka to allow the fans to see Shawn pulling down his trunks and mooning them on the big screen and then kissing Hunter on the lips. Shawn, Hunter and even Chyna pointed at one another's crotches and told everyone, "Suck it." Hunter called out to me, in the first glimpse I'd had of his obsession with his own penis, "I'm bigger than you, and I'm better than you, in more ways than one." Shawn then looked in amazement at Hunter's fly and winced as he exclaimed, "Good God. You could put an eye out with that thing." The dressing room was full of grieving, confused wrestlers, all wondering where the business was going. As I drove back to Kansas City after the show, I looked up at a stunning autumn sunset and wondered what any of these antics had to do with wrestling. I also wondered why Shawn seemed to have such a hold on Vince. More and more airtime was devoted to sleazy soap opera as the artistry of great work faded from the collective consciousness of the fans. Vince used to be the biggest fan of all. He had a passion for technicians, a love for characters and a deep appreciation for storytellers. I couldn't fathom how he could be the one encouraging the sabotage of what he and the old school boys, and even the longtime fans, held so dear. I felt like I'd been tossed in the air and hadn't landed yet, out of control and totally blind to what lay ahead. Because I was an independent contractor, my living depended not just on talent, but on reputation. Remembering what Vince had done with Hulk and others, I felt a sense of foreboding. Vince was about to tear me down, destroying my credibility and marketability. I never understood how he could be so disloyal whenever he parted ways with those who'd sacrificed so much for him and his business. But for Vince, loyalty was almost always a one-way street. My heart kept going back to Brian. 35 years old with 5 kids. He went to sleep not knowing that his wife had just found out that she was pregnant again. Flyin' Brian was flying with the angels now. I recited the Lord's Prayer to an orange Kansas sky, adding a plea for myself, God, I'll probably never be here again. Please get me home in one piece. A couple of days later, I was in LA to do an appearance on Mad TV and was able to arrange a meeting with Eric Bischoff, who also happened to be in town. He was still interested in me, he said, but he couldn't negotiate until I had clearance to do so from the WWF. Eric told me that there were all kinds of ongoing legal battles between the WWF and WCW going back as far as when Alundra Blaze, the champion of a short-lived women's division of the WWF, showed up on Nitro and dropped the WWF belt in a garbage can. Since Vince's logo was on the belt, Vince had WCW by the balls for trademark infringement. The latest court battle had Vince charging Eric with tortuous interference over the Hall and Nash deal, saying Eric had encouraged them to breach their contract with him. I didn't tell Eric that Vince had said he wanted to help me make this deal, but I did tell him that Vince said I could leave any way I wanted, even as champion. Eric made it clear that it didn't matter to him at all whether I was still champion, advising me simply to leave on good terms. I retained the title in a triple threat match in San Jose on October 12th with Stone Cold, Hunter and my boy Shamrock. Sean was the guest referee. After the match, with Jim Neidhart and Ken beside me in the dressing room, I made a short speech to Sean, knowing that it was official that we would face each other in a title match at Survivor Series 97, which was going to be in Montreal this time. I just want you to know that despite any differences we've had this past year, I have no problem working with you. You can trust me in every way to be a professional. What you need to know, Sean, is that you're not in any danger. I added, I also want you to know that I have no problem dropping the belt to you if that's what Vince wants. He glared back at me. I appreciate that, but I want you to know that I'm not willing to do the same thing for you. And then he left. Jim snorted, I can't believe that he just said that. There was no way I could ever drop the belt to him now. He just showed complete disrespect not only to me, but to the position of champion, which was an affront to old school traditions and a betrayal of each and every wrestler who ever looked to me as a leader in the dressing room, or who had been a leader himself. What kind of arrogant little prick would say that to a champion offering to put him over? Since my deal with Vince was that I had creative control of my character for my last 30 days in the WWF, it was up to me whom I lost the championship to. I figured I'd drop the belt to Stone Cold instead. Bischoff's offer from the WCW came through, $1.8 million a year for 3 years. I told Eric if he couldn't get me $2.80 to forget about it. He said he'd have an answer for me by the middle of the next week. If it turned out that I had to leave the WWF, I started to envision one last interview, thanking the fans, all of the wrestlers and Vince, for everything he'd done for me. I still couldn't decide whether Vince was going to kill me off or if he was actually looking out for me, as he made out he was. Was it really so much to ask to be able to leave with my head up? Oklahoma City Raw on October 20th was more of the same. Sean pulled his pants down on camera while Hunter blocked the view with a cardboard Degeneration X sign. New York Post columnist Phil Mushnick was the one who coined the phrase, in an article that was actually critical of the drift of the WWF into sex, sleaze and soap opera, and away from wrestling. Then Sean and the Clique took it proudly as their name, and DX came to life in the WWF, as a rebel group of wrestlers out to defy authority and take over the business. The original members were Sean, Hunter, Kevin Nash, Razor Ramon, 1-2-3 Kid and Chyna. Even worse was the storyline where a gang of militant black badasses called the Nation of Domination had their dressing room trashed and sprayed with graffiti and Canadian flags. By the end of the show I wasn't just portrayed as homophobic but as a racist too. These antics contrasted poorly with Vince's idea of honoring past NWA champions on this same show. I felt a little embarrassed when I shook the hands of Luthez Dory and Terry Funk and Danny Hodge, who was a champion boxer and also an Olympic silver medalist in wrestling. The following day at a taped Raw in Tulsa I informed Vince where I was with WCW, stressing that the window he'd given me to negotiate with them closed on November 1st. Well, whatever happens, we'll deal with it, he said. He told me that he was trying everything, even selling property, to be able to afford to keep me. Then he said, I wanted to talk to you about Survivor Series. I want you to drop the belt to Sean, but you'll win it back for a 6th time at the December 7th pay-per-view in Springfield, that is, if you're still with me. If I end up staying, it doesn't make any sense to me that you'd want to beat me in Canada and then have me win the belt back in the States, I replied. I told him word for word how Sean had told me he wouldn't put me over. Vince's face got tense and red, and he asked me if I'd mind repeating everything I'd said in front of Sean. I'd be happy to. Later that night, Vince called us both to his office, and when we sat down he blurted out, "Sean, I'm putting the belt back on you." Sean began to cry, thanking me and telling me how much he respected me. I said, "Sean, you just told me 4 days ago in San Jose that you'd never put me over." Sean brushed away his tears, sniffling. "Sometimes I say the stupidest things. I always put my foot in my own mouth." I had to get out of there. "I don't know what's going to happen at Survivor Series, and I'm not agreeing to anything yet," I said. "We'll see where all of this is going, and Vince, you know what I'm talking about." I called Eric, leaving him numerous messages over the next 3 days, but I never heard a peep. When I arrived at the Nassau Coliseum on October 24th, Vince was there to greet me. He told me that he could pay me after all, that my money was no longer a problem. I told him I hadn't heard a thing from Bischoff and that if the money problem was solved I'd likely stay, but I also told him that until I heard back, I'd have to keep my options open. Then I left on a 4-day tour of the Middle East, thinking that Bischoff was just jerking me around and that I'd likely have to stay on with Vince. At the airport in Muscat, Oman, kids of all ages enthusiastically greeted me waving huge Canadian flags. I wondered where they'd got them and then realized that they were all hand-sewn. There was a mosque right next to the hotel, and from the balcony of my room I could hear chants of prayer. I found myself praying to any god there was to help me make the right decision. At the final show in Bahrain, I retained the belt when Taker was disqualified. Despite being tombstoned, I was proudly clapped to my feet and presented with an Arab Championship belt and a huge, bowl-like trophy. I was still a hero everywhere outside America. October 31st, 1997. As soon as I walked in the door of my house in Calgary, Bischoff called. He told me they were up to $2.5 million for 125 days a year. "What else is it going to take to get you down here?" he asked. I told him I'd talk to my people and get back to him right away. I called my lawyer, who kept saying over and over, "We have a sweetie of a deal." I decided to think everything through and call Vince first thing in the morning. So on Saturday I called Vince and told him what WCW had offered. "I want to stay with you, Vince, and my contract is fine just the way it is, but I need you to tell me where I'm going and what I'm doing." "What's the rest of my story going to be?" Vince told me that he'd think about it and call me back. But as the deadline crept closer, he still hadn't called. I finally tracked him down getting his hair cut in Manhattan. "Vince, I've only got until midnight." He told me not to worry about the deadline and to call him Sunday morning. Minutes later I had my lawyer on the line telling me that Vince's word over the phone meant nothing in a court of law. I had one last talk with Eric, who happily said, "What else? Whatever it is that you want, you better say it now." I hesitated, but then said, "I can be late sometimes. I've never missed a show in 14 years or hurt another wrestler in my career. I'll always be on time for my match. But with Vince I'm allowed to get there at showtime." "What else?" "Injury insurance. With Vince I'm totally covered for everything. We'll get you insurance." "Anything else?" After a long pause I said, "That's it. Done. 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 I guess we had a deal." While I waited for the document to pop out of my fax machine, I called Vince. No answer. It was nearly midnight on the East Coast when Vince finally called back. His message to me, expressed with smug good humor, was that I should think with my head and not my heart. When I asked him what he had in mind for me, he gave me that stupid laugh of his and told me that first I'd put Sean over at Survivor Series, then I'd put him over at a Final Four pay-per-view next month that would lead into a ladder match at the Royal Rumble, where I'd put him over again. Finally I'd challenge him to one last match on a Raw, where I'd promise that if I didn't win, I'd quit forever. Everybody would think I was going to lose, but, Vince chuckled, "We'll fuck him and you'll get your hand raised." "You've got to be kidding," I said. "I thought you'd come up with something to make me stay." Vince got irritated with me now. "I dunno, you tell me, what do you want to do?" "Hell, Vince, you're the genius. You made me turn heel, made me say all kinds of things about Americans, and they all hate me now. You turned off my heat and gave it all to Sean, and all I am anymore is a lukewarm heel. I don't even know what to do with me." Vince told me again to think with my head, not my heart, and take the WCW offer. After we hung up, I checked my fax machine and saw the WCW contract coming in. I sat alone, in the dark, with tears in my eyes. I signed, put the contract back into the feeder, dialed the number, and pushed send. I found myself reciting the Lord's Prayer as my 14-year career in the WWF passed before my eyes. On Sunday morning, I called Vince at home. He was friendly and more than a little quick as far as I was concerned to advise me that I'd done the right thing. He still wanted Shawn to beat me at Survivor Series the following weekend. I cut him off. "I'm sorry, Vince. I've always done everything you've asked, but I can't do that. I'll put over anybody you want, but I will not, under any circumstances, put over Shawn Michaels. Where do you get this stuff? Come on, Vince. I made myself clear to both you and Shawn in Tulsa. I'll drop it to Austin or Taker. Hell, I'll even drop it to Lombardi at the Garden. Vince, you told me I could leave any way I wanted. Remember, I'll have to sue you. In my contract, I have creative control for my last 30 days. We could tie our assholes up in court for years over this." I told him again that I wouldn't do it. Everything has been geared toward the Canadian hero winning this match. It'll kill me off to lose to Shawn in Montreal after everything he's done. He's picked his nose on TV with the Canadian flag, and just last week he said that Stu is dead on international TV. I'd lose all my self-respect. If he puts me over, I'll be happy to put him over. We've got over a month until I go to WCW. Vince, surely we can come up with something. For the rest of the week we went back and forth. He'd tell me I could win, then he'd tell me I couldn't. I stood my ground and refused to lose, for the first and only time in my career.